Disrespect has consequences, especially when it's directed at an 81-year-old veteran peacefully enjoying his breakfast at a local diner. The thug who delivered that fateful slap had no idea who would walk through those doors next. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morning light filtered through the blinds of the small-town diner, casting long golden stripes across the worn linoleum floor. Walter Branson pushed open the glass door at precisely 8:15, the familiar bell announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle. The 81-year-old Korean War veteran moved with deliberate steps, his gait slower than in his youth, but still carrying the disciplined posture of a man who had served his country with pride. "Morning, Mr. Branson," called Judy from behind the counter, already reaching for the coffee pot. She didn't need to ask how he took it anymore. Black, no sugar, in the blue mug with the chipped handle. Walter nodded in acknowledgement, making his way to the corner booth that had unofficially become his over the years. The vinyl seat creaked beneath him as he settled in, the worn flannel shirt hanging loosely on his frame. His sturdy boots, polished despite their age, were planted firmly on the floor, a habit from military days that never quite left him. The diner hummed with quiet morning activity. A couple whispered over pancakes by the window, a truck driver hunched over his breakfast at the counter, and the cook's spatula created a rhythmic soundtrack from the kitchen. For Walter, this symphony of ordinary life was a comfort, a daily ritual as essential as breathing. He removed his flat cap and placed it beside him, revealing thinning white hair combed neatly to the side. His weathered hands, marked with liver spots and a slight tremor that had developed in recent years, wrapped around the warm mug Judy placed before him. "Toast coming right up," she said with a smile that brightened her tired eyes. The veteran sipped his coffee slowly, savoring the bitter warmth. Outside the window, he watched the town wake up, shopkeepers unlocking doors, early morning joggers passing by, a school bus making its rounds. This view from his booth had barely changed in the 15 years since his wife Margaret had passed, leaving him to navigate his twilight years alone. Walter's gaze drifted to the small American flag pin on his shirt collar, a quiet testament to sacrifices made long ago in a foreign land. The memories of Korea still visited him sometimes, in dreams, in the crack of thunder that sounded too much like artillery, in the faces of young men who would never know what he and his generation had endured. But here, in this diner, with sunlight warming his shoulders and the familiar clinking of cups and silverware around him, Walter found a peaceful solitude. His morning coffee ritual was more than habit. It was an anchor, a reminder that even in a world that seemed to be forgetting men like him, there were still corners where he belonged. Despite the tremor in his hands, Walter Branson's weathered fingers wrapped around the white ceramic mug with practiced care. The coffee inside rippled slightly with each small shake, but never spilled, a testament to years of adapting to his body's gradual betrayal. His eyes, though, remained clear and sharp beneath bushy white eyebrows, holding a quiet dignity that spoke of battles fought long ago and hardships weathered with stoic resilience. The morning sunlight caught the edges of his face, highlighting deep lines carved by 8 decades of life. The Korean War veteran never spoke much about his military service, but it showed in his posture, back straight despite his years, shoulders squared even when his joints ached with the promise of rain. Even now, as he methodically added 1 sugar packet to his coffee, there was a precision to his movements that hinted at military discipline never quite abandoned. "Your usual toast coming right up, Mr. Branson," called Maggie, the morning waitress, her voice carrying a warmth reserved for favorite customers. Walter nodded his thanks, his expression softening momentarily. The staff at the diner had come to rely on his punctuality, 8:15 every single morning, as dependable as the ancient wall clock above the counter. Some of the younger employees even joked they could set their watches by his arrival. The elderly man was a fixture in the corner booth by the window, as much a part of the diner as the vinyl seats and the bell above the door. He always ordered the same breakfast: black coffee with 1 sugar, wheat toast, and 2 eggs over easy. He always left a generous tip, despite living on what everyone knew must be a modest pension. What most patrons didn't know was how Walter's ritual at the diner had become his lifeline after his wife passed 5 years ago. The familiar faces, the predictable routine, the simple human connections, they anchored him when grief threatened to wash him away. The establishment had become more than just a place to eat. It was where he felt human, acknowledged, respected. The veteran sipped his coffee, savoring the warmth and bitter sweetness. His gaze drifted to the street outside, watching the town slowly come to life. Young people rushed past the window, hurried and distracted by their devices, rarely glancing up to notice the world around them. Walter didn't judge them. Times had changed, and he had changed with them, even if more slowly. He adjusted the cuff of his flannel shirt, covering the faded tattoo that marked his service years. Some memories were best kept private, wrapped in silence and dignity, much like the man himself. The peaceful morning rhythm at the diner shattered when the front door banged open. A broad-shouldered man in his 30s stormed to the counter, his face flushed with anger. The waitress, who had just refilled Walter Branson's coffee cup, hurried over with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Excuse me, but there's a mistake on my bill," the man announced. Loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice carried the edge of someone looking for a fight rather than a solution. "I'd be happy to check that for you, sir," she replied, her voice steady, despite her fingers nervously tapping against her order pad. Walter sipped his coffee, watching the scene unfold from his corner booth. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. He'd seen this type before: men who carried their anger like a weapon, ready to swing it at the first available target. $15 for eggs and toast? That's highway robbery. The man slapped his palm against the laminated menu. "It says $12.95 right here." "That price doesn't include the side of bacon you ordered, sir," the waitress explained, her voice dropping as she tried to defuse the situation. The man's voice rose another notch. "I didn't order any damn bacon." Several patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A couple near the door exchanged glances, the woman reaching for her purse as if preparing to leave. The cook peered out from the kitchen, spatula in hand, assessing the situation. Walter set down his mug, his weathered hands steady despite his age. He didn't mean to stare, but something about bullies had always drawn his attention, a habit formed during his military days when identifying threats meant survival. The angry customer suddenly caught Walter's gaze, their eyes locked across the diner, and something dangerous flickered in the younger man's expression. His nostrils flared, as if offended by the elderly veteran's steady observation. "What are you looking at, old man?" he called out, turning his frustration toward an easier target. Walter didn't respond, didn't look away. 81 years had taught him that some men mistake dignity for weakness, silence for fear. The waitress touched the man's arm, trying to redirect his attention. "Sir, please, let me check with the kitchen about your order." But the damage was done. The thug shrugged off her hand, his eyes narrowing at Walter. What had been mere frustration transformed into something more volatile, pride wounded by the calm, unflinching gaze of an old man who refused to be intimidated. The air in the diner grew heavy with tension. Walter's fingers tightened around his coffee cup as the man took a step in his direction, anger radiating from him like heat from asphalt on a summer day. The sound of raised voices had been escalating for minutes, but no one expected what happened next. Without warning, the broad-shouldered man abandoned his argument with the waitress and stormed across the diner's worn linoleum floor. His face contorted with misdirected rage, he towered over Walter Branson's booth. The elderly veteran looked up, confusion crossing his weathered features. just before the thug's open palm connected with his cheek in a sharp, cracking slap. The impact knocked Walter sideways against the vinyl seat. His coffee cup toppled, dark liquid spreading across the table like spilled ink. The Korean War veteran's wire-rimmed glasses clattered to the floor, leaving him squinting and disoriented. Time seemed to freeze. The dining room fell into a shocked silence so complete you could hear the kitchen clock ticking. A fork dropped somewhere, the metallic clang almost deafening in the stillness. The waitress stood paralyzed behind the counter, coffee pot suspended mid-pour, her mouth forming a perfect O of horror. "Mind your own business, old man," the thug snarled, his voice unnaturally loud in the hushed room. Walter's hand trembled as he raised it to his face, fingers gently probing the angry red mark blooming across his cheek. The pain was sharp, but the 81-year-old had endured far worse in his lifetime. It was the public humiliation that cut deeper, the casual cruelty delivered without provocation in a place he'd considered safe for years. Around the diner, patrons averted their eyes. Some stared intently at suddenly fascinating breakfast plates. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, shame evident in their postures. No one moved to help. No one spoke up. The collective cowardice was palpable, hanging in the air like the scent of burned toast. The thug stood there for a moment longer, seeming almost surprised by his own actions. Then, with a dismissive snort, he turned back toward the counter, shoulders squared as if daring anyone to challenge him. Walter remained perfectly still, his military discipline evident even in this moment of shock. His weathered hands, hands that had once carried wounded comrades across battlefields, now shook uncontrollably as he reached for a napkin to dab at the spilled coffee. His cheek throbbed with each heartbeat, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache of dignity violated. The waitress finally found her voice. "Sir, are you okay?" she called, her words quavering. Walter didn't answer. He couldn't. The lump in his throat prevented speech as he sat there, stunned and suddenly very aware of how vulnerable age had made him in a world that no longer valued what he had sacrificed. Walter Branson slowly raised a weathered hand to his stinging cheek, the imprint of the stranger's palm burning against his skin. The Korean War veteran had endured artillery fire and the bitter cold of foreign mountains decades ago. Yet this public humiliation cut deeper than physical pain ever could. It wasn't the slap that shocked him. It was the casual cruelty, the disregard for his 81 years of life and service. "Please, everyone stay calm," the waitress pleaded, her voice quavering as she hovered uncertainly between tables. Her hands trembled as she clutched a coffee pot, knuckles white against the glass. She'd known Walter for years, had poured his coffee hundreds of mornings, and now stood frozen in disbelief at what had transpired in her normally peaceful establishment. Around the diner, the other patrons became intensely interested in their breakfast plates. An elderly couple stared fixedly at their toast. A businessman buried his face in his newspaper. A young mother pulled her child closer, whispering something in the little one's ear. No one made eye contact with Walter or the aggressor, shame and fear keeping them anchored to their seats. The thug loomed over Walter's booth, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the table. "Got something else to say, old man?" he sneered. Seemingly emboldened by the collective silence of the room, Walter said nothing. He'd faced worse than this angry young man. The veteran simply straightened his worn flannel shirt with dignity, his eyes reflecting not fear, but a profound sadness. This wasn't the America he had fought for all those years ago. The diner's usual morning symphony, the clink of silverware, the hiss of the grill, the gentle murmur of conversation, had given way to a suffocating silence. Even the cook peered cautiously through the service window, spatula suspended in midair. A coffee cup rattled as someone set it down too quickly. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Walter's trembling fingers found his own cup, but he made no move to drink. The coffee that had been his morning comfort for years now seemed tasteless, irrelevant. He glanced toward the window, watching as normal life continued outside. People walking dogs, checking mailboxes, living their lives, unaware of the small tragedy unfolding within these walls. The waitress finally approached his table, refill pot in hand, her eyes brimming with unspoken apologies. "Mr. Branson," she whispered, "are you all right?" He nodded once, the gesture more habit than truth. The physical pain would fade. The memory of sitting alone while others watched would not. Walter Branson sat in his corner booth, one weathered hand gently covering the throbbing bruise on his cheek. His coffee had grown cold, the once comforting aroma now lost on him as he stared out the window at the parking lot. The morning sun cast long shadows across the diner floor, but the warmth failed to reach him. The veteran's fingers trembled slightly as he lowered his hand to the table. It wasn't the pain that bothered him. Physical discomfort was an old companion after all these years. He'd endured far worse in Korea, where winter nights froze the blood and enemy fire had left scars that still pulled at his skin in cold weather. No, what cut deeper was the casual cruelty, the disrespect that seemed to permeate the world these days. Walter had watched society change over 8 decades, had witnessed the slow erosion of the values he'd fought to protect. The sting of the slap was nothing compared to the ache of seeing how easily people turned away, how quickly they chose silence over standing up for what was right. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Branson?" the waitress asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding looking directly at his injury. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied, his voice steady despite everything. The old soldier had mastered composure long ago. As she walked away, Walter noticed how the other patrons had returned to their meals. Their conversations hushed as if nothing had happened. A few occasionally glanced his way with pity or embarrassment, but none approached. The invisible wall around him seemed to have grown thicker. He reached for his wallet, fingers brushing against the faded photograph he always carried. Himself in uniform, standing tall beside fellow soldiers whose names he still recited in quiet moments. Those men had understood loyalty. They'd known what it meant to stand beside someone when it mattered. Walter left his usual generous tip, despite having barely touched his meal. His pension was thin, but some habits of dignity couldn't be compromised. The money represented something more than payment for service. It was acknowledgement of another human being's worth. He considered leaving, but found himself unable to move. This diner had been his sanctuary for years, the one place where routine provided comfort in a world that increasingly made less sense to him. To flee now felt like surrendering the last bit of normalcy in his life. So Walter Branson remained, shoulders straight, despite the weight of years and disappointment. Not out of fear or stubbornness, but because somewhere beneath the grief and isolation, a small flame of hope still flickered. Hope that the world hadn't completely forgotten what respect truly meant. For Walter Branson, the diner had been his sanctuary for nearly 15 years. The worn vinyl seats, the perpetually steaming coffee, the gentle clink of silverware against plates, these sounds and sensations had become the backdrop to his solitary mornings. Unlike his sparse apartment where silence pressed in from all sides, here he found comfort in being part of something living and breathing, even if he rarely participated beyond polite exchanges. "More coffee, Mr. Branson?" the waitress would ask, already knowing his answer would be a grateful nod. She never rushed him, understanding that his $4 breakfast stretched into a 2-hour reprieve from loneliness. The elderly veteran tipped generously despite living on a pension that barely covered his medications and modest rent. The staff appreciated this gesture from a man who clearly counted his pennies carefully. In this diner, Walter wasn't defined by his service in Korea, by the nightmares that still occasionally jolted him awake, or by the tremor in his hands that had worsened with age. Here, he was simply Mr. Branson, the quiet gentleman in booth 7, who read the newspaper front to back and occasionally smiled at children who waved at him from nearby tables. Now, as he sat with his hand pressed against his stinging cheek, that sense of safety had shattered. The familiar sounds of the diner continued. Coffee being poured, orders called out, the bell above the door announcing comings and goings, but they no longer brought comfort. Instead, they highlighted how quickly his world had shifted. One moment of violence had transformed his refuge into a place of humiliation. Walter stared at his reflection in the window beside his booth. The man looking back seemed suddenly older, more fragile than he'd allowed himself to believe. What hurt more than the physical pain was the realization that no one had stood up for him. Not the young couple who'd quickly averted their eyes. Not the businessman who'd buried himself deeper in his newspaper. Not even the cook who'd merely watched from behind the counter. He thought of his son Thomas, whom he hadn't spoken to in nearly 12 years. Would Thomas have stood by silently too? The thought brought a deeper ache than the bruise forming on his face. Their estrangement had begun with harsh words after his wife's funeral. Thomas blaming him for being too distant during his childhood. Walter unable to explain how the war had hollowed something inside him that he never fully recovered. The veteran sighed, his coffee now cold and forgotten. This diner had been the one place where memories didn't haunt him, where he could simply exist in the present moment. Now even that small mercy had been taken away, tainted by the casual cruelty of a stranger and the silent complicity of everyone else. Time crawled by with cruel indifference as Walter Branson remained fixed in his corner booth. The hands of the clock on the wall seemed to move in slow motion, each tick echoing the dull ache in his cheek. 1 hour had passed since the incident, yet the veteran couldn't bring himself to leave. His coffee had grown cold, untouched since the moment that young man's hand had connected with his face. Walter's weathered fingers traced the edge of the ceramic mug, his trademark tremor more pronounced now. The diner had returned to its normal rhythm, waitresses bustling between tables, the cook calling out orders, the cash register chiming. But nothing felt the same. Conversations around him had resumed, though noticeably hushed, punctuated by furtive glances in his direction. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Branson?" the waitress asked, her voice gentle with pity that made his stomach turn. He shook his head, offering a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. The elderly man had nowhere particular to go. His small apartment waited for him, empty and silent as it had been since Margaret passed 3 years ago. Tuesday afternoons meant reruns on television and the same 4 walls that had witnessed his slow descent into solitude. At least here, among the clinking silverware and murmured conversations, he wasn't completely alone. Walter shifted at his seat, his joints protesting. Pride kept his spine straight, despite the humiliation that weighed on his shoulders. He'd faced worse in Korea, much worse. Yet somehow this public degradation cut deeper than he cared to admit. Not because of the physical pain, which was minimal compared to what he'd endured, but because of what it represented. A world that no longer valued what he and his generation had sacrificed. Still, something kept him rooted to that vinyl seat. Perhaps it was stubbornness, refusing to let that bully dictate when he should leave his sanctuary. Or maybe it was something more profound, a flickering hope that humanity wasn't completely lost. After all, these walls had witnessed countless acts of kindness over the years. Strangers paying for each other's meals, children drawing pictures for the staff, community rallying during hard times. Walter gazed out the window, watching cars pass on the street. Each vehicle carried people with their own stories, their own struggles. The world kept turning, indifferent to one old man's moment of shame. Yet he couldn't help but feel that something was about to change. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the pressure drop before a storm. He would wait a little longer. Something told him these walls still had stories to tell. The bell above the diner's door jingled, a cheerful sound that belied the tension hanging in the air. Every head turned as the heavy glass door swung open, admitting a gust of cool air and the unmistakable presence of leather and chrome. 5 men entered, their movements deliberate and synchronized, as if they operated as a single unit rather than individuals. The Hells Angels commanded attention without demanding it. Their leather vests, adorned with patches and insignias, told stories of brotherhood and miles traveled. Tattooed arms, some completely sleeved in intricate artwork, extended from beneath cut-off denim jackets. The heavy thud of their boots against the linoleum floor seemed to echo throughout the suddenly silent establishment. The waitress froze mid-pour at the counter, coffee streaming dangerously close to overflowing a customer's cup. She recovered quickly, setting down the pot with trembling hands before wiping them nervously on her apron. The other patrons shifted in their seats, some averting their eyes, while others stared openly, a mixture of fascination and apprehension evident in their expressions. Walter Branson remained still in his corner booth, his bruised cheek forgotten for a moment as he observed the newcomers. The old veteran had seen enough in his 81 years to recognize that appearances often deceived. These men, intimidating as they might seem to others, moved with a discipline that reminded him of his military days, each aware of the other's positions, maintaining formation even in this casual setting. The bikers scanned the diner methodically, their faces impassive but alert. The largest of them, a mountain of a man with a salt and pepper beard cascading down his chest, nodded almost imperceptibly to his companions. They spread out slightly, taking positions that gave them clear sightlines to every corner of the small restaurant. The thug who had struck Walter earlier shifted uncomfortably on his stool, suddenly finding his half-eaten meal fascinating. His shoulders hunched forward, as if trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable in the charged atmosphere. For Walter, time seemed to slow. The diner that had been his sanctuary for years now felt like the stage for something momentous. The clinking of silverware had ceased. Conversations had died mid-sentence. Even the sizzle from the grill in the kitchen seemed muted, as if the building itself held its breath. The leader of the group stood just inside the doorway, his eyes methodically sweeping the room until they locked onto Walter's bruised face. Something flickered in the biker's expression, recognition, followed by a hardening of his features that transformed his face from merely imposing to truly formidable. Thomas Branson stood at the center of the leather-clad group, his imposing figure drawing every eye in the diner. The gray streaks in his beard caught the morning light streaming through the windows, giving him an almost silver aura of authority. His weathered face, etched with lines that spoke of hard miles on open roads, scanned the room with deliberate precision. Walter's coffee cup trembled slightly in his grip as recognition dawned. It had been 7 years since he'd last seen his son, at his wife's funeral, where they'd exchanged barely 10 words. The Korean War veteran straightened his posture instinctively, a soldier's reflex that never quite faded, even as his fingers continued their subtle dance of age-induced tremors. "Dad," Thomas mouthed silently, his eyes locking with his father's across the diner. The other bikers remained by the entrance, a wall of leather vests emblazoned with their club insignia. They stood with the casual confidence of men accustomed to commanding space, their presence transforming the humble establishment into something electric with potential energy. Walter's bruised cheek seemed to throb more intensely under his son's gaze. He hadn't called Thomas, hadn't spoken to him in years, yet somehow he was here. The old man's mind raced through possibilities. Had the waitress called him? Did someone recognize him as Walter's son? Thomas removed his riding gloves with deliberate movements, tucking them into his back pocket. His eyes never left the bruise forming on his father's face, the redness stark against Walter's pale skin. The middle-aged biker's jaw tightened visibly, a muscle working beneath the beard. Around them, the diner had fallen into a hush. The clinking of silverware ceased, Conversations died mid-sentence, and even the sizzle from the grill seemed to quiet in deference to the moment unfolding. The waitress stood frozen beside the coffee machine, pot in hand, her eyes darting between Walter and the newcomers. She recognized Thomas from the single faded photograph Walter kept in his wallet, the one he sometimes looked at when he thought no one was watching. With measured steps that echoed against the linoleum floor, Thomas began moving toward his father's booth. Each footfall seemed to carry the weight of their shared history, birthdays missed, arguments unresolved, and silences that had stretched into years. Walter's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Pride and stubbornness had kept father and son apart. But now, as Thomas approached, something else flickered in the veteran's eyes, a tentative hope, fragile as a candle flame in winter. Thomas Branson's jaw clenched as his eyes locked onto the purpling bruise marring his father's weathered cheek. The sight sent a cold fury through him, like ice in his veins. He stood motionless for a moment, his leather vest creaking slightly as his shoulders tensed. Behind him, his brothers in the Hells Angels shifted their weight, the atmosphere in the diner changing as they collectively sensed the gravity of the situation. "Who did this?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enough weight to silence the murmurs around them. Walter touched his cheek self-consciously, his trembling fingers betraying his age. "It's nothing, son," he said, the word son sounding foreign after years of estrangement. The middle-aged biker's eyes scanned the diner until they landed on a broad-shouldered man at the counter, the same one who had been arguing loudly earlier. The thug was hunched over his coffee, oblivious to the storm brewing behind him. He laughed at something on his smartphone, completely unaware that the consequences of his actions were about to catch up with him. "That him?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer from the way his father's eyes briefly flickered toward the counter before dropping back to the tabletop. The waitress approached cautiously, coffee pot in hand, her eyes darting nervously between Thomas and his companions. "More coffee, Mr. Branson?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Walter nodded, grateful for the distraction. As she poured, her hand shook, causing a few drops to splash onto the table. "I'm sorry about what happened," she whispered. "I should have done something." Thomas placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "You're not the one who needs to apologize," he said, his voice gentle but firm. The other bikers had positioned themselves strategically around the diner, not threatening but present. Their weathered faces and steady gazes created an invisible barrier of protection around Walter's booth. Some patrons shifted uncomfortably, while others watched with a mixture of fear and curiosity. At the counter, the thug remained oblivious, scrolling through his device, occasionally taking loud sips of his coffee. He was like a man standing on train tracks, unaware of the locomotive bearing down on him. Thomas took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving his father's face. The years between them seemed to compress into this single moment, all the missed birthdays, holidays, and conversations distilled into the silent communication passing between them now. The veteran's hands still trembled, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a spark of the dignity that had been momentarily stolen from him. Thomas stood up slowly, his decision made. The other Hells Angels straightened, ready to follow their brother's lead. The storm was about to break, and the thug at the counter had no idea what was coming. Thomas Branson crossed the diner floor with measured steps, his leather boots barely making a sound against the worn linoleum. The other patrons seemed to hold their breath as the imposing Hells Angel made his way toward the corner booth. Walter's eyes followed his son's approach, a mixture of surprise and something deeper, perhaps hope, flickering across his weathered face. Without asking permission, Thomas slid into the seat opposite his father. The vinyl cushion creaked under his weight. For a moment, neither man spoke. The biker's tattooed hands rested on the table, fingers drumming once, before stilling completely. Then, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior, he reached across and placed his calloused palm over Walter's trembling one. "Dad," he said simply, the word hanging between them like a bridge neither had crossed in years. The elderly veteran's eyes glistened as he looked at his son's hand covering his own. How long had it been? 8 years? 10? The arguments and disappointments that had driven them apart now seemed trivial compared to the simple human connection of skin against skin. "You look well, Thomas," Walter finally managed, his voice catching slightly. He didn't mention the bruise forming on his cheek, or the humiliation he'd suffered. He didn't have to. The middle-aged biker nodded, his gray-streaked beard catching the morning light streaming through the window. "Got your message from Doreen last week. Was planning to come by anyway." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Didn't expect to find you like this." A waitress approached with fresh coffee, then thought better of it and retreated, sensing the gravity of the moment unfolding in the corner booth. Behind Thomas, his brothers in leather stood guard, a respectful distance away but unmistakably present. "Wasn't expecting to see you with company," Walter remarked, nodding toward the bikers. Thomas's mouth curved slightly. "Family comes in different forms, Dad. Something I learned from you, actually." The silence that followed wasn't empty, but filled with unspoken words. Apologies never voiced, explanations never given, and forgiveness never requested. Yet somehow, in that moment, the weight of their estrangement seemed lighter. Walter's fingers moved slightly under his son's hand, not pulling away but adjusting, as if remembering how to accept comfort after years of solitude. The Korean War veteran had faced bullets and watched friends fall, but this quiet reconciliation required a different kind of courage. "You didn't have to come," the old man said finally. Thomas's eyes, so like his father's, held steady. "Yes, I did." In that simple exchange, years of distance began to dissolve. Not completely, there were too many wounds for that, but enough to start healing. The diner around them continued its morning rhythm, but for the two Branson men, time had momentarily suspended, allowing them a space to rediscover what had never truly been lost. The thug finally noticed the group of leather-clad men who had entered the diner. His eyes narrowed as he spotted Thomas Branson sitting across from Walter, their hands connected in a silent moment of reconciliation. Something about this new dynamic threatened his perceived dominance of the space. "What's this? The old man called for backup?" he sneered, his voice carrying across the now quiet diner. He pushed himself away from the counter, coffee sloshing over the rim of his cup as he approached the booth. "Didn't know veterans needed babysitters these days." Thomas remained seated, his weathered hand still resting protectively over his father's. The 5 other Hell's Angels stood nearby, their presence filling the small establishment without a single word spoken. Their leather vests bore patches that told stories of brotherhood and miles traveled, their tattooed arms crossed in silent vigilance. "You got something to say to me?" the thug continued, his bravado wavering slightly as he took in the full measure of the men before him. "Or did Grandpa here exaggerate what happened?" Walter's bruised cheek told the truth that needed no embellishment. The elderly veteran sat straighter now, dignity returning to his posture with his son beside him. "Nice costumes," the antagonist said with a forced laugh, gesturing at the bikers' leather vests. "You boys dress up just to protect one old man who can't take a little criticism?" The waitress froze behind the counter, her hands clutching a coffee pot so tightly her knuckles whitened. Regular customers slid deeper into their booths, recognizing the dangerous current running through the air. One of the Hell's Angels shifted his weight, boots creaking against the linoleum floor. The sound alone made the thug flinch, though he quickly tried to mask it with another laugh that came out hollow and uncertain. "I don't know what the old-timer told you, but he was disrespecting me," the young man insisted, his voice rising in pitch as he pointed accusingly at Walter. "Some people need to learn respect." Thomas's companions remained silent sentinels, their stillness more intimidating than any movement could have been. They didn't advance or retreat, creating a wall of solidarity that spoke volumes about their loyalty. The thug's confidence continued to erode under their collective gaze. His eyes darted between the bikers, seeking any sign of weakness and finding none. The swagger that had allowed him to strike an elderly veteran now abandoned him, leaving behind a man suddenly aware of his vulnerability. He took a half-step backward, his earlier boldness evaporating in the face of this unified front. The diner had become a different world, one where his actions had consequences and where Walter Branson was not alone. Thomas Branson leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table as he held the thug's gaze. The diner had fallen into a silence so complete you could hear the coffee percolating behind the counter. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard without having to raise his voice. "That man you just struck," Thomas said, nodding toward Walter, "is Walter Branson. He's my father." The words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. "And before you decide to open your mouth again, you should know that he spent 2 years in Korea watching his friends die so people like you could have the freedom to act like fools." The thug's expression flickered between defiance and uncertainty as he glanced between father and son, finally noticing the family resemblance in their eyes. "My father gave more to this country before he turned 21 than you'll give in your entire worthless life," Thomas continued, his tone measured but firm. "He hadn't come here this morning looking for trouble. He came for his coffee and his peace, the same as he's done every day for the past 15 years. Around them, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. Customers who had averted their eyes during the initial confrontation now watched openly, their shame at their inaction giving way to something like respect. The waitress stood nearby, coffee pot clutched to her chest, her earlier trembling subsiding as she witnessed the defense of her regular customer. "I don't know what kind of man thinks it's acceptable to strike an 81-year-old veteran," Thomas said, "but I know exactly what kind of man my father is." He straightened slightly, his leather vest creaking. "He taught me that real strength isn't about how hard you can hit someone. It's about dignity, respect. Things you clearly know nothing about." The thug's bravado visibly crumbled under Thomas's unwavering gaze. His shoulders, previously squared for confrontation, began to slump. The other patrons' eyes bore into him from all directions, their collective judgment palpable in the still air of the establishment. Walter sat quietly, watching his son with a mixture of pride and wonder. The years of distance between them seemed to dissolve in this moment of unexpected defense. He noticed how the other Hell's Angels remained positioned near the door, not threatening, but present, a silent wall of support for their brother and his father. "So here's what's going to happen," Thomas said, his voice dropping even lower, forcing everyone to lean in slightly to hear. "You're going to apologize to my father. Then you're going to leave this diner, and you're never going to come back. Because if you do," he left the sentence unfinished, the implication hanging in the air like smoke. The thug's face blanched as Thomas Branson's words hung in the air. The weight of his actions suddenly crashed down upon him like a physical burden. He looked around the diner, once his arena of dominance, now transformed into a court where he stood condemned. The other patrons' eyes, which had earlier averted in shame, now watched with a mixture of relief and vindication. His earlier bravado evaporated under the steady gaze of Thomas and the silent presence of the leather-clad men behind him. Thomas didn't move from his seat across from his father. He didn't need to. His calm authority filled the space more effectively than any physical intimidation could have. "Now you know," he replied simply, his voice level but firm. "And knowing means you've got a choice about what happens next." Walter Branson sat quietly, his weathered hands now steady around his coffee cup. The Korean War veteran, watched his son handle the situation with a dignity that made his chest swell with unexpected pride. The thug took a step backward, nearly stumbling into an empty chair. The waitress, who had been frozen behind the counter, exhaled audibly. The Brotherhood of Bikers remained positioned near the entrance, their stance relaxed, but purposeful, creating an unspoken barrier between the aggressor and his escape route. "I'm sorry," the young man muttered, though his eyes darted toward the door rather than meeting Walter's gaze. The apology hung hollow in the air, born more from fear than genuine remorse. Thomas nodded once, acknowledging not the sincerity, but the submission. "My father fought for your right to walk out of here today," he said. "Remember that the next time you think about raising your hand to someone who's earned their peace." The thug backed away, his earlier swagger replaced by a hasty retreat. He fumbled with his wallet, throwing several crumpled bills onto the counter before pushing through the door. The bell jingled sharply as he disappeared into the street, the sound punctuating his exit like the period at the end of an unpleasant sentence. Through the window, the patrons watched him hurry to his vehicle, shoulders hunched against an invisible weight. As he drove away, the collective tension in the diner seemed to dissolve, replaced by a palpable relief. No fists had been raised, no threats had been made, yet justice, in its quiet way, had been served. The power of respect had proven stronger than the impulse toward violence, a lesson not lost on anyone present, least of all Walter, who looked at his son with newfound appreciation. Walter Branson exhaled deeply, his weathered hands finally steady as they wrapped around his coffee cup. For the first time since he'd taken his usual seat that morning, relief washed over him like a gentle tide. The diner, which had moments ago felt like a battleground, now settled back into its familiar comfort, the clink of silverware, the hum of conversation, and the scent of fresh coffee creating a cocoon of normalcy. "Thank you, son," Walter said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung between them, weighted with years of silence and missed opportunities. The elderly veteran looked at Thomas with new eyes, seeing not just the intimidating biker with tattoos and a leather vest, but glimpses of the boy he once knew. Thomas nodded, his gray-streaked beard catching the morning light streaming through the diner windows. "Nobody touches my father," he replied simply, as if those 4 words could bridge the canyon of years between them. In many ways, they did. The waitress approached cautiously, coffee pot in hand, offering refills with a grateful smile. "On the house today, gentlemen," she said, her earlier trembling replaced by genuine warmth. As she poured, Walter noticed how the other patrons now looked at him, not with pity or avoidance, but with something akin to respect. "You didn't need to throw a punch," Walter observed, studying his son's face. "That took more strength than anything else." Thomas's lips quirked into a half-smile. "The angels taught me that respect doesn't always come from fear. Sometimes it's about standing your ground without crossing the line." He paused, running a finger along the table's edge. "Something I should have learned from you years ago." The unspoken history between them, the arguments, the slammed doors, the phone calls never made, seemed to dissipate slightly in the steam rising from their cups. Walter's hand, marked with age spots and the slight tremor that had become his constant companion, reached across the table. After a moment's hesitation, Thomas's calloused palm met his father's. Around them, the Hells Angels maintained a respectful distance, occupying nearby booths but giving father and son space for this moment. Their presence, once intimidating, now felt protective, a shield against the disrespect that had marred the morning. "I come here every day at 8:15, Walter said, the invitation clear in his tone. Thomas nodded, understanding the olive branch being extended. "Maybe I'll join you sometime." The simple exchange carried the weight of promise, not of perfect reconciliation, but of a beginning. For Walter, it was enough. The bruise on his cheek would fade, but this bridge between them, built on respect rather than violence, might finally have a chance to stand. The waitress approached the booth with a fresh pot of coffee, her hands still trembling slightly from the tension that had filled the diner moments before. She poured a steaming cup for Walter Branson first, then one for his son. "Thank you," she whispered to Thomas, her voice barely audible above the gentle murmur that had begun to fill the establishment again. Not many would stand up like that. Thomas nodded, his weathered face softening just enough to acknowledge her gratitude without breaking his composed demeanor. The other Hell's Angels remained standing nearby, their leather vests bearing patches and insignias that told stories of brotherhood and loyalty. Around the diner, the atmosphere was transforming. What had been a room frozen in fearful silence was now coming back to life. An elderly couple at a nearby table exchanged glances before the woman leaned over to her husband. "That's how men used to behave," she said, loud enough for Walter to hear. "Standing up for what's right." A middle-aged businessman, who had been hiding behind his newspaper during the confrontation, folded it deliberately and approached the booth. He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable, but determined. "Sir," he addressed Walter, "I want to apologize for not saying anything earlier. What happened to you was unacceptable." The veteran looked up, surprised by the stranger's words. His weathered hand touched his bruised cheek briefly before he nodded in acknowledgement. More patrons began to stir, shame giving way to a collective sense of responsibility. A young mother with her child in tow stopped by the table. "My father served too," she said softly. "Thank you for your service." The waitress returned with a slice of apple pie, placing it before Walter. "On the house, Mr. Branson," she insisted, her eyes conveying more than her words could express. Thomas watched as the community awakened around them. These were the same people who had sat in silence when his father was assaulted. Yet something had shifted. The presence of the bikers had done more than intimidate a bully. It had reminded everyone of values they'd forgotten: respect, courage, and standing together. One of the Hell's Angels, a mountain of a man with a salt and pepper beard, placed a gentle hand on Walter's shoulder. "Anytime you need us, sir, we're around." Walter's eyes glistened as he looked around the diner. For years, he had come here seeking only coffee and solitude. Now, in the wake of cruelty, he had found something he'd thought long lost, a community awakening to its better nature, and the son he'd missed for too many years. The diner hummed with a nervous energy as several patrons rose from their seats, shame coloring their faces. A middle-aged woman in a floral dress approached Walter Branson's booth first, her hands clasped tightly together. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything," she whispered. "What happened to you was terrible." Walter nodded, his weathered face softening. The bruise on his cheek had begun to darken, but the veteran's eyes remained clear and forgiving. A balding man in a business suit followed, extending his hand. "Sir, I served in Desert Storm. Should have stood up for you. We veterans need to stick together." One by one, they came, offering apologies, respect, and handshakes. Thomas watched silently, his leather vest creaking as he shifted in the booth. The other Hell's Angels maintained a respectful distance, standing guard near the entrance, their presence ensuring no further incidents would occur. When the small crowd dispersed, father and son sat in a moment of awkward silence. The waitress brought fresh coffee, her hands steadier now as she poured 2 steaming cups. "You didn't have to do that," Walter said finally, his voice raspy but dignified. "But I'm glad you did." Thomas ran a hand through his gray-streaked beard. "Nobody touches my father, even if we haven't spoken in 12 years, Walter finished, wrapping his trembling fingers around the warm mug. "Seems like a lifetime ago." The elderly man gazed out the window at the parking lot where the motorcycles gleamed in the morning sun. He took a careful sip of coffee, then looked directly at his son. "You know, Thomas, I've seen things in Korea that still wake me up at night. Fought battles where I didn't think I'd make it home." The veteran's voice grew stronger with each word. But the hardest battle isn't the one fought with guns and tanks. Thomas leaned forward, his attention fixed on his father's words. The hardest battle is keeping family close, Walter continued. Took me 81 years to figure that out. Wasted too many of them being stubborn. A flicker of emotion crossed Thomas's face as he reached across the table. His calloused hand covered his father's, steadying the tremor. Maybe we both did, the biker admitted. Walter nodded, a small smile breaking through the pain of his bruised face. Never too late to call a truce, son. Around them, the diner had settled back into its routine. Dishes clinking, conversations resuming, life continuing. But at this booth, in this moment, something broken had begun to mend. Thomas Branson ran a weathered hand through his gray-streaked beard, his father's words settling deep within him. The diner had fallen into a comfortable quiet, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. I've wasted too many years, Thomas admitted, his voice low enough that only Walter could hear. Pride kept me away when I should have been here. Walter Branson reached across the table, his trembling fingers finding his son's calloused hand. The Korean War veteran's eyes held no judgment, only the patient understanding that comes from decades of life's hardships. Family isn't about perfect timing, the elderly man said. It's about showing up when it matters. Around them, the diner had transformed from a place of shame to something sacred. The waitress approached with a pot of fresh coffee, her smile genuine as she topped off their cups. She no longer saw just an old veteran and intimidating biker, but a father and son rebuilding what had been broken. In the days that followed, the corner booth became their meeting place. Tuesday mornings at 9, Walter would arrive first, ordering 2 coffees instead of 1. Thomas would rumble up on his motorcycle minutes later, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by his brothers from the club. The Hells Angels treated the veteran with a deference that surprised the diner's regular patrons. These men, feared by many, would remove their leather gloves to shake Walter's hand, listening intently as he occasionally shared stories from Korea that he'd never told anyone, not even Thomas as a boy. Your father's a warrior, one of Thomas's oldest friends in the club told him after meeting Walter for the 3rd time. Different battlefield than ours, but the same code. The diner itself seemed to embrace its new role. The waitress reserved the corner booth without being asked, and other customers would nod respectfully toward Walter and Thomas. The incident with the thug now part of local lore, a story about respect rather than violence. One morning, Thomas arrived with a small wooden box. He placed it between them on the table, opening it to reveal a Purple Heart medal. Found it when clearing out Mom's things years ago, he explained. Never knew when to give it back to you. Walter's fingers traced the medal's edges, memories flooding back. Thought I'd lost this forever, he whispered. The diner had become more than just a place for coffee. It had become the ground where father and son rebuilt their bond, where the years between them narrowed with each shared meal, and where a community witnessed the power of reconciliation, proving that even the deepest divides could be bridged with respect and time. The diner became Walter Branson's sanctuary once more, but with a profound difference. No longer did he sit in solitude, nursing a cooling cup of coffee with trembling hands. Now, 3 mornings a week, Thomas would join him, sometimes arriving on his rumbling motorcycle, other times in a weathered pickup truck. The father and son would share breakfast, bridging decades of silence with careful conversations that grew easier with each passing month. Word spread quickly through the small town about what had happened that day. The story evolved with each telling. Some claimed Thomas had thrown the aggressor through a window. Others insisted the entire Hells Angels chapter had surrounded the man. Walter would simply smile at these embellishments, appreciating the underlying truth. His son had stood for him when he needed it most. The waitress who had witnessed everything became something of a guardian to the elderly veteran, ensuring his coffee cup never emptied and occasionally slipping him an extra slice of pie, on the house. She noticed how Walter's posture had straightened, how his eyes held a renewed spark that had been absent before. "You know," Walter told Thomas, one crisp autumn morning as sunlight streamed through the diner windows, "I spent years wondering where I went wrong with you. Now I see I got it backwards. You turned out just fine." Thomas's weathered face softened. "Took me too long to come back around." "We're both stubborn men," the veteran replied with a knowing smile. "Always have been." On Walter's 82nd birthday, the diner erupted in surprise when 5 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot. Thomas's brothers from the club filed in, each nodding respectfully to the elderly man before presenting him with a leather vest, not a full member's colors, but a special honorary patch showing his service dates and a simple message, "Respected." The gesture moved Walter to tears. He never wore the vest outside the diner, but it hung proudly in his modest apartment, a symbol of the unexpected turn his life had taken. For the patrons who witnessed that fateful morning, the lesson remained clear. They watched the elderly veteran and his son, the unlikely harmony between a man who had served his country in uniform and one who wore the colors of an outlaw motorcycle club. Their story reminded everyone that respect transcends appearance, that loyalty finds its own path, and that it's never too late for family to find its way back together. In the end, the cruelty that had once shattered the morning silence had inadvertently restored something far more precious, a father's pride and a son's devotion, proving that even from the darkest moments, light could still emerge.